Pregame.com.
Welcome into pregame.com. I'm Pauly Howard. That's Teddy Covers Championship Sunday. Two big games. It should get a good matchup in the Super Bowl, no matter what happens on Sunday. Let's start in the NFC. Packers at the Seahawks. 25-2 straight up for Russell Wilson at home. How good is this Seattle team?
Oh, I mean, we're talking about the defending Super Bowl champs who are absolutely on a tear right now. And look at the numbers. I mean, the numbers are very clear. You talked about the 25-2 straight up. How about 26-1 against the spread? You know, you might have gotten 20-7. That's with Russell Wilson at quarterback. In the postseason, 5-1 straight up, 5-0-1 against the spread. Depending on where you got that Saints line last year, again, as we're showing here, these half points can and do matter, both in the regular season and in the postseason. But, you know, they haven't basically lost a game against the spread with Wilson at quarterback in the playoffs. 26-1 against the spread versus opponents with winning records. They're not just beating patsies, they're beating elites. Oh, and by the way, they come into this game on a 7-game straight up and against the spread winning streak. The defending champs are pretty darn good. Yep. You know, let's not sell them short by any stretch of the imagination. And obviously, we know from Pete Carroll's tenure at USC, once he gets his team playing at a very high level, they tend to stay playing at a very high level. You know, the Seahawks, they're elite, you know, and they're not in the Final Four by accident.
Maybe one of the best home field advantages in all of sports. 5 touchdowns in the last 7 games. Defense has been great. Are you concerned how Rodgers and the Packers struggled on the road, especially against top 10 defenses?
Oh, and the numbers are very clear for Rodgers. You know, 28-0 touchdown to interception ratio at home at Lambeau. On the road, 13 touchdown passes for the season compared to 5 interceptions. Good, but not 28-0, you know, when it comes to TD to INT. Green Bay 2-5-1 against the number on the road this year. ATS 4-4 straight up. They certainly showed vulnerability. 39 points per game average at home, 21 points per game average away. So all of those stats, again, show very clearly that the Packers, on paper, aren't supposed to be as good in hostile environments as they've been in the friendly confines of Lambeau Field.
What's factored into the spread and what isn't factored in?
Well, all this is factored into the spread. That's the thing. These stats that I'm just talking about, how Green Bay wasn't as good in the regular season on the road, and all the success the Seahawks have had straight up and against the spread at home, and all the success Seattle's had stepping up in class with Wilson, this is all factored into the point spread. What's also factored in the point spread is that 7-game straight up and ATS winning streak for the Seahawks. And that has made this a little bit of an inflated point spread. So you can certainly understand if Rodgers is hobbling and Rodgers takes hits and Rodgers doesn't finish this game and it's Matt Flynn in for Green Bay,
yep,
Seattle's going to win and cover. But as we saw in the second half last week, now I'm not going to compare the Cowboys defense with the Seahawks defense, but as we saw in the second half last week, even with the injury, Aaron Rodgers is capable. His receiving core is capable. That's an elite-level passing game. And Rodgers, again, if there's one quarterback that I want to win one game today, Aaron Rodgers is my guy. Maybe not with the hamstring injury, but even with that, or the calf injury, I should say, but even with the bad calf, Aaron Rodgers showed us last week, and I expect will show us this week, that he's a pretty darn good QB to be giving a touchdown or more to, even in a hostile environment on the road. And let's not forget the Seahawks last week. Seattle finishes +3 in turnovers. They got a 90-yard pick 6 in that ball game. They're playing against a team that won 7 games in the regular season. And Seattle barely, by the slimmest of margins, by a half point, eke out a half-point point spread cover. That tells us the markets are a little bit too hot on Seattle. There might be some value here on the Green Bay side.
Does week 1 mean anything?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing.
189 yards, blown out?
It's a different...
Didn't even look at Sherman's side of the field?
Well, let's talk about some of the nuances for that week 1 game. Because let's not forget the Packers were not healthy in the preseason. They didn't have their starting defense together at all on the field in the preseason. And Capers didn't do anything with them when he had his starters in the field, on the field. They weren't in his usual aggressive blitzing schemes. Rodgers wasn't healthy in the preseason. His receiving core wasn't healthy in the preseason. So when they went into Seattle on that opening Thursday night, it was the Seahawks against a team wearing Packer uniforms, but it wasn't the same Green Bay team that we're going to see on Sunday. Not even close. And, of course, the fact that that game was played in September Hey, the Titans beat the Chiefs on Kansas City in September.
Right.
I mean, it's a long, long time ago. From a confidence factor, I don't think it affects Green Bay one iota. And from a matchup standpoint, the Packers were missing a lot of key players in that ballgame, or a lot of guys getting their first real playing time. That's not the case here in January.
All right, that's the NFC Championship game. On to the AFC, the late game, Colts at the Patriots. This also was a blowout. And New England thumped them on the road on Sunday night. In that game, Gray had 200 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's had 20 carries since and even played last week. And then New England comes out, 66 plays. Brady dropped back to pass 54 times. I wouldn't be surprised if Belichick runs it 30, 40 times, and they didn't even try to run the ball against Baltimore.
And that's one of the difficult handicaps of this ball game is that, the game plan that the Colts had, or the Patriots had against the Colts, not just this year, they did the exact same thing last year. It was 42-20 in November. New England had 1 punt in that ball game, more than 500 yards of offense. They moved the ball like a hot knife through butter throughout, and spent the game nearly exclusively in these 6 lineman power rushing formations. You talked about Jonas Gray, who was never heard of before. He wasn't unheralded. He was unheard of coming into that game, and he hasn't been heard of since. Now they got LeGarrette Blount, who could fulfill that same role here. And yet last week against Baltimore, 1 rushing attempt in the second half of that ball game. And you know what it was? It was a Tom Brady quarterback sneak.
Yeah.
They didn't hand the ball off even once after halftime against the Ravens. But, of course, the Ravens are strong defensively in front and weak in the secondary. Tom Brady was able to exploit that. This week, we could see a very different game plan because what happened last year when it was 43-22 was a similar story. 200 on the ground, 200 through the air, a very balanced attack against this Colt defense. And in fact, they played in 2012 as well with another very similar result. So if this is a case where history hasn't repeated itself once, hasn't repeated itself twice, it's repeated itself 3 times with New England with this power rushing game plan against Seattle. But, of course, as you mentioned, a Patriots team that threw the ball 54 times last week, and you're not sure if the Patriots are going to take the exact same approach or if Belichick switches it up a little bit here.
Yeah.
It's a difficult chess match for Chuck Pagano.
And New England's had a lot of issues, ATS, in the playoffs, especially at home. We have to give the Colts a ton of credit. I thought they were a fraud. You saw they struggled against teams that won the division. They went out, they beat Denver, Peyton Manning in the playoffs again. But I couldn't believe they abandoned the run. Anderson had 60 yards at the half. Everything was they took shots deep. Manning just missed a couple throws. They went away from that, and everything was a 5-yard pass in the second half. It was a bizarre game.
Well, what happened was the Broncos' offensive line couldn't control Indy's pass rush. And Indy's not known for having a great pass rush. This is not a team that has been putting pressure on opposing quarterbacks all year long. But they dominated the line of scrimmage against Denver. They dominated the line of scrimmage against Cincinnati the week before. Obviously, we've seen great cornerback play. I mean, tremendous cornerback play from both guys. Vontae Davis, the guy that gets all the headlines. Greg Toller was every bit as good.
Yeah.
And we're talking about guys that can sit out in single coverage on the outside and make secure tackles. The Patriots get so much of their yards after the catch. Brady's not firing away downfield. He'll take a couple of shots, but a lot of their passing game for the Patriots is dink and dunk. And against guys like Toller and Davis who tackle very, very well, those dinks and dunks don't become first downs and big gainers.
And if we broke this down and you say the Colts are going to win the game, I would have said Luck has 400 yards and goes crazy against Denver. That wasn't the case either. He played well, but they had 60 yards rushing on 23 carries, with Herron at least. Nix only had 2 catches. Hilton had 4 catches.
It was the defense.
Yeah.
And I'm with you 100% that in thinking of game plans where Indy theoretically could beat Denver, it wasn't Indy and under. That was in my mind. It was Indy and over. And Luck's interceptions, and we threw 2 picks in that ball game, but both of them were on 3rd and long. He's like, let's just take a shot. Both were interceptions. They served as effectively as punts. So I don't downgrade Luck off of that performance. Of course, it's a Patriots defense that really struggled against Joe Flacco and company last week. And as you mentioned, a Patriots team that has struggled covering point spreads and even winning games on their home field in the postseason. But the fundamental question for me in this ballgame is what we've seen out of Indy's defense. We saw them shut down Cincinnati. I mean, they held Hill in that ball game to like 43 yards on the ground. Then they shut down Peyton Manning last week. Was it Indy's defense? Or was it, Bengals' offensive line being problematic, Bengals' wide receiving core being banged up, Denver's wide receiving core being banged up, Peyton Manning aging,
5 of 21 passes longer than 5 yards?
Manning was awful.
Oh, my God.
It was awful.
Yeah.
And some of that was Indy's defense, and some of that was Peyton Manning looking very, very old. Looking like a guy who may not come back next year. I think he will, but looking like a guy who, maybe not so much. Mm-hmm. Do we give Indy's defense all the credit, some of the credit, none of the credit? And that, to me, is a fundamental handicap here. Because if you think the Colts' defense is as good as it's looked the last 2 weeks, you have to take Indy plus the points here. And if you think that the Colts' defense over the last 2 weeks has achieved their success based on flaws from their opponents, well, maybe you look at the New England side, especially because here's Indy 3-0 against the spread their last 3. New England 0-3 against the spread their last 3. So the guys who are winning with any given team are going to keep rolling with that team. The people that bet Indy last week likely to bet them this week. So that point spread momentum can be actually something that hurts you in the postseason more than it helps you. Sometimes you say, oh, well, that team's not valued correctly. Yeah, after 19 weeks of NFL action, teams are usually valued pretty close to correctly. But when a team gets hot or cold ATS in January, the lines move fairly significantly. And the reason that the Colts are 6.5-point dogs, not 7 or 7.5 like they were at the opener, is in large part because of their point spread success here in January, while New England has come up short, as I mentioned, in each of their last 3 ball games.
Great numbers, Teddy. Now, let's make it official. For the free pick, we go back to the NFC title game.
Yeah, I have to. I have to take Green Bay plus 7.5 in this ball game. And the hook here is key. We talked about all of that success that Seattle has had at home, that Seattle has had against good teams, that Seattle has had against the Packers. You're paying a premium to support the Seahawks. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is going to be hopeless in this ball game. And I look at Green Bay as being too good of a team to be catching more than a touchdown. So I have to look at Green Bay plus 7.5. That's the play of the day.
Excellent work, Teddy. Should be 2 good games. Hope you make some money out there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on pregame.com.